I think this is one of the most underrated chronographs around at the moment, not just design, but mechanically as well. And although the price plays quite a big factor in that, I think even if you ignore the price, it's still an outrageous package. This is the Longines Big Eye. I first came across this watch when shooting the About Effing Time podcast with George Bamford and Andrew McCutcheon. And Andrew McCutcheon owned one of these watches, and that's how I fell in love with it. I actually borrowed it for quite a few episodes. Now, I feel like I should give a bit of a warning here. This video isn't sponsored by Longines. However, I am going to be very complimentary about this watch. I didn't even borrow this watch off Longines. This watch was lent to me by one of my good friends, Ben, who runs a watch blog, wristworthy.uk. He bought this watch in memory of one of his good friends who passed away, and I think that is such a great way to remember someone. Longines, I think certainly within the watch community, it's well known, well respected, but I think in perhaps the wider market, it's kind of often overlooked. Certainly over here in the West, I know in China, the Far East, Longines is a big deal, but over here, I feel like people often perhaps gravitate more towards Tudor, or people tend to then save a bit more and then go up to Omega or buy an Omega pre-owned. Now, I get drawn to watches, like a lot of us, by the looks of them first, and then I fall down the rabbit hole of doing a bit of research around the watch, and then I feel like I learned something technical about it, and then that justifies the love for it, or perhaps just deepens the love for the watch. And the movement inside this thing, it's really quite impressive, so impressive that Omega themselves adopted this movement. Longines has a massive history of creating aviation watches, and this Big Eye is part of their heritage range. It was originally launched back in 2017, and there's been quite a few versions, different metals, but this steel version with the black dial is by far my favorite. It's got a very obvious military style about it. It looks very similar to something like a Breguet Type 20, but actually this watch is a reinterpretation of an old Big Eye that Longines did back in the 1930s. And you've probably guessed by now, the Big Eye refers to that oversized subdial over at 3 o'clock. This is showing the elapsed minutes of the chronograph in a 30-minute register. The Big Eye subdial has been enlarged to improve legibility for pilots when they're using the watch, along with the rest of the design of the watch, with the very smooth large numerals and then the high contrast dial, white on black. Let's go through the specs and then break the watch down even further, especially the movement on this thing. So this case is in stainless steel, it's 41mm wide, it's 14.5mm thick, 48.7mm lug to lug, has 20mm lugs, a box sapphire crystal, and it has 30 meters of water resistance. The dial is a very flat black, a satin, very smooth matte black, and then the numerals are all lume. The subdials have snailing inside and are ever so slightly recessed into the dial, and it's hard to see the snailing with the naked eye, but it kind of gives it this radial glossy look to it. The case, as you can see, is a very traditional case, but it has some clever features about it because it is so epically thick. At 14.5mm thick and with a very slab-sided case, Longines have been smart around how they've executed the case to give the appearance or the wearability of it being slightly thinner. For example, the case back has quite an aggressive slope to it, quite an aggressive angle to it, so when it's on the wrist, you don't actually see the case being held up. You don't see the thickness of that case back. They've also mounted the lugs, not so the lugs meet the case at the top and bottom of the case, but actually they're mounted just a little bit lower than the top of the case and quite a bit higher than the base of the case. Again, giving the feeling that the watch is slimmer than it actually is. Off the wrist, it is a chunky beast of a watch, but when it's on the wrist, it's so much more wearable and you don't actually notice it's heavy and it is thick, but it doesn't feel anywhere near as thick as the measurements suggest. Now, it has a very traditional vintage styling within the design of the case. There are no crown guards, there are no pusher guards, and no doubt those pushers will get ripped off at some point, but I actually prefer the clean look, the kind of naked look of it not having any guards. And then we have this very large, oversized crown. The sapphire crystal is a box sapphire crystal, which adds to that vintage styling. If you think about with vintage watches having a domed acrylic glass, this very much gives a similar effect of that. One thing that I think is important to note is the fact that Longines have put anti-reflective coating on the underside only on this watch. So many brands are putting anti-reflective coating on both sides of the sapphire crystal, which I don't understand because the anti-reflective coating will scratch off, rendering the sapphire crystal less clear. And that's the whole point in having the sapphire crystal, because it's crystal clear and really scratch resistant. So I don't understand why brands put a very scratchable material on top of a very scratch resistant material. The very traditional case and military styling of this watch lends it to being an absolute strap monster. This looks killer on a single piece nylon strap, like the straps that we sell over at barkandjack.com. Typically, I do shoehorn in a plug for the straps that we sell over at barkandjack.com, but this is one of those watches that just looks completely at home on a single piece nylon strap. I'd pair this with one of our tubular nylon straps because the texture brings out that military feel, that vintage feel, but it's also a very strong material that is thin, so it doesn't add too much to the height of the watch, but it can also handle the weight of the watch. Check out these straps and many more over at barkandjack.com. Now let's talk about the movement, because the movement has an interesting history, but it also has quite a few brag tags to it. So this is the Longines caliber L688. It's an automatic column wheel chronograph movement. It beats at 28,800 vibrations per hour, and it has 66 hours of power reserve. The layout of the movement is the time is in the normal place, the hours and minutes. We have the running seconds over at 9 o'clock. As I've mentioned, we've got the big eye at 3 o'clock. That is the elapsed minute for the chronograph. Down the bottom at 6 o'clock, we have the elapsed hours of the chronograph, and then the central seconds hand, that is the running seconds for the chronograph function. Now, I mentioned that this is a column wheel chronograph movement. A column wheel chronograph movement is seen as a higher end form of a chronograph compared to the more common cam actuated chronograph. The operation of a column wheel chronograph is more smooth and less jittery. However, the downside is it requires more force within the movement to operate. There's more pressure going on inside the movement. That means the parts inside need to be able to withstand this increased pressure or this higher pressure. Therefore, inherently, they need to be made to a better standard. Therefore, it is typically a better made movement. A cam actuated chronograph is a simpler, more affordable way of making a chronograph movement. Us watch people are mechanical snobs, hence why we choose a highly complex, expensive mechanical movement over a very cheap, much more accurate quartz movement. So for us, the idea of something being simpler and cheaper to make is simply less desirable. That's why typically a chronograph having a column wheel is a brag tag. Ironically, the most famous chronograph, the NASA certified Omega Speedmaster, is powered by a cheaper cam actuated chronograph movement. But Omega then has space to sell their watches and Longines doesn't. Most chronographs in this price range will be powered by a movement like the ETA 7750 or the similar variant, the 7753. It's just rotated a little bit. That's the most popular chronograph movement, or the sleeker variant, which is the SW500. It would be expected for Longines to have used that ETA 7750. However, they're using the L688. Longines is part of the Swatch Group, and within the Swatch Group, ETA are the movement manufacturer for brands within the Swatch Group. Longines didn't want to use the ETA 7750. They wanted something a little bit different, a little higher end. So Longines asked ETA if they could build them a column wheel chronograph movement. ETA took their 7753 movement and completely reworked it, made quite a few modifications, but the main thing being Longines' request of changing it to be a column wheel chronograph. It went through quite a few iterations, as you can imagine, but ETA ended up with the caliber A03.L01. This was presented to Longines solely for Longines to use, and they named it the L688. That was until Omega saw it. They liked it and asked ETA if they could install their coaxial escapement. Omega calls this their caliber 3330. It's been used in the Omega Speedmaster racing series, the current Speedmaster 38mm range, the Speedmaster Mark II, and the Seamaster chronographs. So this Longines Big Eye isn't just a good looking watch. This is powered by a movement so highly regarded that Omega used it themselves. Granted, the addition of the coaxial escapement is a massive upgrade. That's a fantastic escapement. But regardless, that in itself is a pretty big brag tag. And for the price, this costs £2,950 brand new from Longines. You can find it cheaper elsewhere, and on the pre-owned market, these go for less than £2,000. That's quite an outrageous packet. Now, it isn't perfect. There are things that I would change about it, namely the thickness. But that's pretty much the case for all automatic chronographs. They are just chunky beasts. There's a lot of stuff going on inside. You have to spend a huge amount of cash to find yourself a slim chronograph. In fact, I'd like to know, what alternatives are there to this really impressive watch? Let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts are on the Longines Big High and what you would see as an alternative to this. Really good looking watch. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button. If you like to start this video, hit the subscribe button down there and that little bell icon to get notifications when I drop a new video. If you're on Instagram, give me a follow at BarkandJack. And if you want to check out our sexy watch straps, watch accessories, and sexy mugs, jump over to barkandjack.com. See you guys soon. Take care.